What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a combat overview for the Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader Alpha that just dropped today. Owlcat Games gave me access a little bit early, which gave me the opportunity to drop 4 different videos today on the subject, including this video, of course, a general overview, all of the companions available, as well as one about the spaceship exploration and combat. And these videos together, I think, have covered the majority of what's in the alpha, but obviously here we are focused mainly on the combat. That said, remember that this is an alpha. What you are seeing is incomplete. Very specifically, things I'm going to talk about here are incomplete. They've sent me over a pretty detailed guide about the things that are not done, things that are unfinished, things that are likely to see revisions, etc. Now, in terms of combat, most of that is the leveling system and the classes, things like that. A lot of the full options are not available. The core system is pretty much going to be what it's going to be at this point, which is why we're talking about it, but they do still have a lot to add to this. So what we're going to cover are important stats, how classes work, as well as the actual combat in general. But to start off, in the alpha, you start in Chapter 2, which means you don't actually have a character creator, but rather you play from a sort of pre-generated character that is made via a sort of text event where you choose some of your options. Those options are used to sort out your characteristics and thus your skills. Like pretty much every RPG system out there, this system uses base stats, which then give you derivative stats. In this case, the base stats are your characteristics, and your derivative stats are your skills. There are opportunities to raise both as you level up throughout the game, but just remember that raising a characteristic will raise its associated skills as the skills are derived from the characteristics. Now, the system at play here is an adaptation of the D100 system used in the tabletop version of exactly this, Rogue Trader. It's not one for one or anything, but it's similar. And with it being a D100 system, most of the numbers you are going to see here are multiples of 10, sometimes like 35, stuff like that, up to 100, with higher being better. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the characteristics. These are weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, toughness, agility, intelligence, perception, willpower, and fellowship. Weapon and ballistic are easily the most straightforward. They are simply your chance to hit with the associated weapon. Weapon skill affects melee weapons, ballistic skill affects shooting weapons. The rest of them tend to be a little more specific than that or affect multiple things. In the case of strength, this is going to give you more melee damage. It's going to help your physical skill checks. Toughness affects your HP and your resistance to things like poison and stuns. Agility affects your initiative and your dodge chance, so how quickly you get to go in the turn-based combat, as well as your chance to dodge. Intelligence probably sees the most use, as many of your skills, as well as some abilities actually, use intelligence as the base stat. Then we have perception. This also affects initiative as well as reduces enemy damage, and it also has some use with the awareness skill in particular. This is your chance to notice things around you. Then we have willpower. This is primarily used for psychers, but also for resisting mental conditions and psychic attacks. Psychers as a class are not fully implemented yet, and a lot of their skills are missing. They are still very much so in the works, but they're going to be a willpower heavy class. By the way, classes are called careers in this game. And then we have fellowship. Fellowship is charisma, basically. All of the skills that sound like they would affect your ability to influence someone use fellowship. Many of the leadership class abilities also use fellowship. If you're looking to be charismatic and lead a team or be a leader, fellowship is the way to go. Very viable build, by the way. Even in alpha, was having a lot of fun with that. Now, each of these base stats affects a variety of skills, like I mentioned, and luckily, rather than list them, you can actually just see all of the skills are tagged with the stat that affects them just very visibly. They got that little green tag there. Very easy to see at a glance what affects what. So that's a pretty nice feature. Skills are mostly used out of combat. So things like interacting with equipment and objects uses tech use. Demolition is basically disarming traps and destroying walls, stuff like that. Medicae is healing. Athletics tends to be like moving around the environment. Awareness, which is based off perception, does checks passively to scan the environment for anything you missed, that type of stuff. But I think you kind of get the gist of the system. It's relatively straightforward. So next up, we're going to talk about weapons and armor. There's a few key things you need to know. Now, obviously, all items can have like weirdly specific things they do and buffs to certain stats or just other effects to help you out. But there's a handful of specific information you want want from both weapons and armor. When it comes to weapons, what you're looking for is armor penetration, rate of fire, recoil, and parry on melee weapons, though that one's kind of just whatever. Now when it comes to armor penetration, this is how much of a character's deflection stat gets ignored. Deflection is an armor stat we'll talk about here in a minute, but armor penetration ignores a portion of it depending on how much armor penetration you have. Rate of fire is more for ranged weapons, and it's the number of shots per volley. So if you have a weapon that has a rate of fire of more than 1, you're going to shoot multiple times. There's also weapons with abilities like burst fire and things that will also affect this. But it's important to know how many shots you're actually making when you use an attack. And then we have recoil. Recoil and rate of fire kind of go hand in hand. If the rate of fire is multiple, the subsequent shots get a reduced chance to hit, and recoil removes that penalty, if you will. So it's not wildly important, but understanding how it works is. And then we have armor. The primary things you need to know about armor are deflection and absorption. Deflection is the value by which incoming damage is reduced. This is a flat number. Absorption is a percentage chance. Absorption reduces the incoming damage after the deflection is calculated. So deflection takes some just straight off the top, and absorption reduces it further by a percentage. So to make this easy, say you take 10 damage, but you have 2 deflection. You take 8 damage. Then you have 50% absorption. You actually only take 4. However, heavier armors reduce your dodge chance and things like that. They make you easier to hit, but able to reduce more of that damage. So a little bit of interplay there, kind of standard for what you would expect in an armor system. And then beyond that, we have more of the usual stuff. You have a bunch of inventory and equipment slots that you can put various things into. You have consumable slots. Each character has 4 initially, and some items are specific to certain characters. For instance, we get an Eldari Ranger as a companion, and some items can only be used by that Ranger because they're made for Eldari. So there is a few things like that, but that's kind of the gist in terms of stats and equipment and inventory. So once we're actually in combat, what's that about? Well, the first thing to understand is that this is a turn-based combat system. It's only going to be turn-based. They have no plans for real-time with pause. That's been known for a while. It's not new information, just so you know. This particular turn-based system uses movement points and action points. On each side of a character's portrait, we can see both. Movement points are 1 for 1. 1 movement point for each tile. 2 movement points if you go diagonal. Again, very standard system. Action points are used for attacks and actions. However, under normal circumstances, you can only use 1 attack per turn unless an ability or other modification says otherwise, but typically abilities. However, you get 4 action points and then more as you level up. These further action points are going to allow you to activate your character's abilities. However, once you use an attack, you don't get to move anymore that turn. So if you want to move, you probably want to do that first. And then you activate your abilities. And then ideally, you want to attack last after you've buffed whatever you're going to buff, etc., moved, that kind of thing. But you can still take other actions after you attack. And as this is a turn-based game, maximizing your amount of turns and how many times you're attacking is a big part of the combat. And taking advantage of abilities that give you multiple attacks is a pretty big deal, and consumables usually don't count against this, so you can, for instance, throw a grenade and still make your attack. Speaking of grenades, friendly fire is very much so a thing. This is more of a thing with actual guns than grenades, but you can absolutely hit your own characters, and when you are shooting with weapons, projectiles can miss. So if you miss the target because you didn't make the roll, you're going to potentially have a percentage chance to hit another object nearby or behind the target. When you shoot a volley of something, say burst fire, you'll see the intended trajectory of everything, but this also applies to enemies. I saw many enemies accidentally kill their friends trying to hit me as well. So it's a thing that goes both ways. Now, AoE attacks, so grenades, flamers, these always hit. There is no percent chance on these. However, they do have a sort of save system where they have a percentage chance to do less damage, kind of like a reflex save in Pathfinder. And last but not least, it is also possible to just straight up dodge. This includes AoE attacks, and if you dodge an AoE, it will physically move your character into a new tile. There's a decent amount of character movement when they get hit, by the way. Now let's talk about cover. This is a turn-based system that has cover, half and full. When in cover and somebody attacks you, there's a percentage chance that it will instead hit the cover, though it is very possible to destroy the cover. A decent amount of objects in the environment, especially cover, are actually destructible If you hit them while trying to hit somebody in cover, throw a grenade on it, that kind of thing, cover is very destructible. But let's say you're not in cover or there's an enemy standing right next to you. It's important to know what you can and can't do here. Obviously, you can only use a melee weapon in melee range. However, there are some things you can't do in melee range. For instance, you can't use a sniper rifle on a target that's right next to you. Moreover, if you're standing right next to an enemy, you're effectively in its threat range, which means if you try to do something like heal, cast a Psyker ability, it will provoke an attack of opportunity. Leaving the square next to an enemy will also provoke an attack of opportunity, and this applies to enemies as well, so mostly just know that attacks of opportunity are a thing here. Now let's talk about the momentum mechanic, and then we'll talk about Psykers specifically a little bit. So momentum is essentially a resource. Whenever you successfully attack or kill enemies, you'll gain it. You'll lose it when you spend it on abilities, or when your characters get damaged or fall unconscious, get knocked out basically. And momentum is used to activate a variety of abilities, desperate measures and heroic acts. Desperate measures are either when the character's health is very low or when momentum has dropped to almost zero. These are usually defensive in nature, but basically they're just like, oh no, I'm about to die. Then we have heroic acts. These are very, very strong. These are like ultimate abilities really. When combat's going your way, you can activate them, and usually what they'll do is let you make multiple attacks with that character. For instance, Argenta, our Sister of Battle, can make like 5 or 6 ranged attacks when she activates hers, called Military Excellence. In addition to momentum, there is one other stat you need to think about, and it mostly involves Psykers, both you and the enemy. This thing is called Veil Thickness. Psykers, or anyone dealing with psychic abilities, can use the powers of the warp to effectively cast magic. However, this is dangerous because this fills your veil thickness meter. If it hits a certain point, it will result in random negative effects, and sometimes this will just summon demons into the fight, things like that. So this is sort of a counterplay to Psykers' very powerful magic abilities, but also enemies can do this too, and they're less likely to be concerned with the negative effects. That said though, Psykers are probably the most incomplete in terms of classes and stuff. A lot of their skills and abilities just aren't quite there yet. Some of the stuff that is there is very powerful though, so you can mess around with it, but I wouldn't expect to enjoy the full system if you jump in now. And last but not least, we have Righteous Fury. This is sort of like doing a critical hit, best I can tell. Occasionally you'll do extra damage called Righteous Fury, which again just seems to be a critical of sorts. But now that I got kind of the particulars out of the way some of this stuff works, I wanted to talk a little more specifically about opinions here. I like this system. From the same devs, we saw Pathfinder Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous, which are very heavy systems, and I love Pathfinder very much, but it's a dense system. I think this system is going to be easier for people to jump into, while at the same time providing a decent amount of depth. You'll notice I didn't talk too much about the classes specifically, mostly because they're not implemented yet, but to give a little bit of an idea of the way that's going to work, there are basic classes or careers, which are like fighter, adept, that kind of thing. And once you max one of those out, you can pick an advanced class. Advanced classes have prerequisites, and you have a choice here. You can usually pick one or another one, which will allow you to specialize. As you level classes up in general, every once in a while, every few levels, you're going to have an opportunity to raise either your characteristics or your skills, usually a selection of certain ones based on the class you have. And then every few levels, you'll pick like a combat feat, which helps you define your build a little bit. And overall, that is just a much less complicated system than Pathfinder, while at the same time providing some depth, the ability to mess around, which when you combine it with the equipment system, I think there's still going to be plenty to play with here that will be easier to onboard people into as well, which will make my life as somebody who's going to be making a bunch of guides for this a bit easier. And on that note, I like the momentum mechanic. From what I've experienced, it's fun. I like the idea of the veil thickness and giving a sort of counterplay to the very powerful Psykers. And overall, I would say my opinion on this combat system is that it's good. It's bare bones at the moment, but it's good. What it needs right now is fleshed out, but that's obviously the case because it's an alpha. And as we move towards beta and of course release, and we get access to classes and character creation, I can honestly say that I'm looking forward to messing around with this. and enjoying what it can offer. Because the way they have it set up, it moves a little faster than Pathfinder's turn-based combat. It's still turn-based combat, so obviously it's not as fast as real-time with pause, but it's definitely a better pace than Pathfinder's turn-based, which has so much going on that it's just kind of slow by default. I also think it's a little easier for people to pick up abilities when you're only dealing with like a dozen as opposed to several dozen, which again just makes it easier for people. But not to ramble on too long, I like the system, I like the direction it's headed in. When we see the rest of the classes and the more fun stuff filled in, I think we'll have even more to talk about, but here's a pretty good idea of what to expect as is. So, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.